The hero of our story, when he was young, did many things that made his father's hair fall out, including climbing a giant tree on a stormy night to get struck by lightning and learn a new technique. He continued like this until he met his mentor, who changed his life completely. Who is this mentor, and what challenges will our hero face on his journey? That's what we'll discover in today's story. Our story begins at midnight under a full moon, casting its pale glow over a scene unfolding in urgency. A figure dashes through the night, carrying another person on his back, who is gravely injured. As the scene expands, it becomes clear that they are part of a group moving at high speed, desperately fleeing from a looming threat. The protagonist, burdened with the injured man, senses their pursuers drawing dangerously close. A swift decision is needed to protect the wounded. He calls out to Cheonsu, who quickly gathers the rest of the group. The protagonist lays the injured man against a tree to let him rest, then instructs Cheonsu to carry him. He emphasizes that the others must secure Cheonsu's path to safety while he stays behind to confront their enemies. The men, however, hesitate, unwilling to abandon their leader. Cheonsu suggests that they all remain to fight together, while the protagonist escapes with the injured man. But the protagonist insists on his plan, arguing that they cannot hold off the enemy for long. He orders them to leave immediately. With no other choice, the men comply, setting off reluctantly. Before their departure, the protagonist sternly commands them to protect the injured at all costs and to keep moving, no matter what happens. The group departs, silently hoping their leader will survive and return to them. Cheonsu hoists the wounded man onto his back and urges the others to move swiftly, following the protagonist's orders. Meanwhile, the protagonist remains behind, ready to face the advancing threat. It isn't long before the enemy arrives. He senses their presence closing in, moving like ghosts or demons in the night. As the enemy surrounds him, the leader reflects on how their path could have been compromised. He realizes that their mission's secrecy must have been betrayed from within by someone of high rank. It was impossible for anyone outside their inner circle to know about the secret mission involving Master Baek Lee-ho. Only a handful of trusted leaders had been privy to the plan, and even they had no knowledge of the precise route. Yet, the Demon Sect had intercepted them. He recalls the moment when their enemies ambushed them, taunting Baek Lee-ho with the promise that his end had come and that this place would be his grave. It is now revealed that the injured man is none other than Baek Lee-ho, the leader of the protagonist's sect. For this reason, saving him is paramount, even at the cost of the protagonist's life. As the memories of the encounter with the Demon Sect flood his mind, the leader becomes increasingly certain that their enemies knew every detail of their route in advance. After careful thought, he concludes that there is no other explanation. The Demon Sect's knowledge of their path must have come from a traitor within their own ranks. The enemy members start circling the protagonist at an incredible speed, their movements too fast to discern. All that remains visible are faint, blood-red trails marking their passage like ominous streaks of light. Standing his ground, the protagonist shouts a warning, declaring that they will only pass over his dead body. The enemy surges toward him from all directions, but the protagonist remains composed, summoning a power akin to lightning. With a single strike, he takes down two of them, sending them crashing to the ground. He raises his sword and leaps into the air, preparing for another assault. In that instant, one of the masked enemies urgently warns his comrades to exercise caution. They now realize whom they are facing, Hwan, the ninth Dragon Prince. Before the enemies could react, Hwan suddenly appeared among them, moving with incredible agility, striking so swiftly that they could not follow his movements. When one of them tried to attack, Hwan was already prepared, felling him with a single blow of his sword. However, the remaining enemies rushed toward him from every direction, but Hwan stood his ground, ready for any move they might make. The enemies launched another assault, but Hwan fought with relentless ferocity, soon staining his robe with their blood. When two of them attacked simultaneously, he parried their strikes, retaliating with a blow charged with lightning that electrified their bodies and sent them reeling. At that moment, two other members of the Demon Sect appeared and ordered the remaining fighters to stand down, declaring that they would personally take care of Hwan. Recognizing the two newcomers as the Jang twins, Li Hwan knew that a difficult battle lay ahead. One of the twins addressed him, warning that knowing who they were meant his end was near. The other continued, coldly informing him that his death was imminent. The twins attacked Li Hwan in unison, but he swiftly dodged their strikes, retreating a few paces. Then, with a powerful turn, he swung his sword toward them, his lightning-infused blow cutting both of them across their arms. Enraged by the injury, the twins attacked with renewed fury, determined to finish him off. Li Hwan remained composed, engaging them in a brutal fight that left both twins severely wounded. However, amidst the chaos, Li Hwan noticed a sharp pain in his shoulder. He had been injured. Yet, he reassured himself that despite the wound, he had successfully stopped the twins from achieving their goal. Suddenly, a booming voice shattered the silence, commenting that it was impossible for him to be an ordinary child, as no mere boy could wield lightning energy with such skill. In the next instant, a powerful figure lunged at Li Hwan, sending him flying backward with immense force. However, Li Hwan managed to block the deadly attack by bracing himself with his sword, deflecting the incoming energy. Li Hwan turned toward his attacker and found himself face-to-face with Hans Shinma, one of the Demon Sect's formidable leaders. Shocked, Li Hwan could hardly believe that Hans Shinma, the celestial demon from the realm of chaos and one of the sect's top 4, stood before him. In that moment, Li Hwan realized that he might be facing his end. Addressing Hans Shinma, Li Hwan acknowledged that he was ready to die, but he requested an answer to one question before his death. Amused, Hans sneered, remarking that even those on the verge of death could not stop being bothersome. However, Li Hwan cleverly responded, questioning why Hans would refuse such a simple request from someone about to die. Intrigued by Li Hwan's wit, Hans decided to humor him. He agreed to answer one question. Seizing the opportunity, Li Hwan asked how the Demon Sect had discovered their route. Hans replied that it was Baek Liho's own sect that had provided the information, though he admitted he didn't know the exact identity of the traitor. Hearing this, Li Hwan's suspicions were confirmed. He stood up, raising his sword, and declared to Hans that, in exchange for the answer, he would now show him a fighting technique he would never forget. Impressed by Li Hwan's determination and skill, Hans Shinma commented that he had never known such a talented boy existed among their enemies. He added that if he had known of his abilities earlier, he would have tried to recruit him into the Demon Sect. Li Hwan scoffed at the idea, replying with sarcasm that he was not foolish enough to join the sect. He questioned what could possibly make him consider such a choice. Just then, a malevolent, fiery aura ignited around Hans Shinma, and with a commanding voice, he informed Li Hwan that joining the sect would never have been his choice to make. He added ominously that the time had not yet come for Li Hwan to witness everything. Despite the clear threat, Li Hwan refuses to give up. He makes a bold attempt to attack Hans Shinma, but the Demon Master reacts instantly, countering with overwhelming force. The blow sends Li Hwan flying backward, crashing hard into the ground. We see Hans Shinma land gracefully after delivering his devastating strike. Li Hwan lies unconscious, his sword discarded beside him. Although gravely injured, Li Hwan managed to wound the celestial demon. Hans Shinma stands over him, visibly astonished that a mere child could inflict such damage. Amused yet intrigued, Hans declares that he now desires Li Hwan's body, intending to claim it for himself. With a sinister smile, he channels his demonic powers, lifting the unconscious boy into the air before slinging him over his shoulder. Before departing, Hans orders his subordinates to hunt down Baek Liho and eliminate him. Then, without another word, he takes to the skies, carrying Li Hwan away. The scene shifts to the Cheonghai Mountains, where 5 days have passed since the confrontation between Li Hwan and Hans Shinma. Deep within a remote cave nestled among the peaks, Li Hwan lies unconscious on the cold ground, with Hans Shinma standing nearby. An elderly man enters the cave and, upon noticing Li Hwan, questions Hans about the boy's identity and why he brought him there. Through their exchange, it becomes clear that the old man is the leader of the Demon Sect and one of its 4 grandmasters. Hans demands that the leader perform the Aryong ritual, a dark art practiced by the sect to transfer a soul into a new body. The old man scoffs, calling the request absurd. Hans reminds him, however, that he had warned the leader before. Hans's current body won't last more than 2 or 3 years at best. He reveals that the wound inflicted by Hwan on his heart has worsened his condition, leaving him with less than a year to live. Angered by Hans's insistence, the leader is reluctant, but Hans persists, expressing his belief that Hwan's body is the perfect vessel for his soul. The leader asks bluntly if Hans intends to proceed with the transfer. After a moment of thought, the leader relents, agreeing that if Hans's condition is truly that dire, they must attempt the ritual. The next day, the scene shifts to preparations for the Aryong ritual. In a chamber called the Baekguk Shrine, the leader carefully lays both Hans Shinma and Hwan in position, preparing to begin the dark ceremony to transfer Hans's soul into Hwan's body. 3 days later, on August 8th, the ritual is complete. The scene changes to a clear, serene sky with beautiful scenery all around. Hwan opens his eyes, awakening after the soul transfer, only to find himself back in the form of a young child. Confused, he wonders how he ended up in this place and why his age seems to have regressed. For a moment, he believes he might be trapped in a dream. The story then shifts to another scene, set in a quiet old village at night. In one of the homes, lights shine through the windows, indicating that the residents are awake. Inside, a man sits, sipping his drink as he converses with a guest who appears to be a stranger to the village. The man asks his guest how life has been, to which the guest replies that nothing has changed. The guest then questions why the man has allowed himself to fall into this state and urges him to rise and face life once more. Grateful for the advice, the man acknowledges that he is well aware of the responsibilities he can no longer afford to ignore. The guest then asks the man why he never considered Hwan in his decisions. Unexpectedly, the man responds with enthusiasm, suggesting that the guest take Hwan with him. Startled by the proposal, the guest listens as the man complains that Hwan is a constant headache. When asked what he means, the man explains that not a day goes by without Hwan causing trouble, and it's impossible to predict who his next victim will be. The man continues grumbling, claiming that Hwan's antics are making him lose his hair. The guest laughs, remarking that Hwan seems to take after his father in his youth. The father vehemently denies this, insisting that he was never as troublesome as his son. Just then, a servant bursts into the room, announcing that the young master Hwan has once again climbed the tall ginkgo tree. It becomes clear that the man is Hwan's father. Furious, the father springs to his feet, vowing to punish Hwan, and storms out of the house with the guest following, observing the situation closely. Outside, the towering ginkgo tree comes into view, with a small child, Hwan, climbing fearlessly to the very top. Standing below the tree, his father shouts at him, demanding that he come down immediately. But Hwan refuses, insisting that lightning is about to strike, and he must wait for it. His father grows even more enraged, yelling that lightning is exactly the reason he must get down. Unfazed, Hwan reminds his father of what he had told him earlier, that he needs to receive a lightning strike to master the Sword of Thunder's spirit technique. Perched at the highest point of the tree, Hwan raises his sword to the sky, awaiting the lightning's arrival. Desperate, his father tries to convince him that all of this is nonsense and that he must come down at once. Meanwhile, the guest watches the scene unfold, lost in thought. He recalls that the Sword of Thunder's spirit was once among the 10 greatest sword techniques in the world and had been the ultimate secret skill of Hwan's family before it was lost more than a century ago. The guest reflects further, noting that none of Hwan's family descendants had been able to master the technique since then, leading to its gradual disappearance from the martial world. He muses that the loss of this technique was the primary reason for the decline of Hwan's family's status. As his thoughts continue, the guest marvels at the sight of a small child climbing a massive ginkgo tree, hoping to be struck by lightning to learn the Sword of Thunder's spirit. He wonders if this is merely reckless childhood behavior or if something deeper is at play. At that moment, the sky rumbles with thunder and heavy rain begins to pour. Li Hwan remains atop the tree, determined to wait for the lightning to strike his sword. Below, his father continues shouting, urging him to come down before he gets hurt. Li Hwan reassures his father, saying that all he needs is one lightning strike. Unbeknownst to Li Hwan, the guest, his father's old friend, moves swiftly, scaling the tree with astonishing speed. In the final moment, just before the lightning strikes, the guest grabs Li Hwan and brings him down skillfully. Once on the ground, Li Hwan's father rushes toward his son, calling out to him anxiously, followed closely by the household servants. But Li Hwan ignores them all, turning instead to the guest who had just saved him, asking about his identity. The guest responds simply, saying that he is an old friend of his father's. Li Hwan's father, still fuming, demands to know what his son was thinking by pulling such a reckless stunt, warning him that the lightning could have seriously injured him. However, Li Hwan brushes off his father's scolding and once again directs his attention to the guest, asking what he intends to do next. The guest, amused, responds with a question of his own. "What do you mean by that?" Li Hwan shouts angrily, accusing the guest of preventing him from obtaining the power of thunder. He adds that martial arts laws state that anyone who causes harm to another must offer compensation. The guest, amused, asks if Li Hwan is implying that he owes him compensation for denying him the chance to gain thunder's power. With a sly grin, Li Hwan replies, "Exactly." The guest pauses briefly, then laughs, proposing to make Li Hwan his disciple as compensation. However, Li Hwan rejects the offer, declaring that he would never become a student of an ordinary person. Only someone among the top 10 swordmasters in the world would be worthy. Before the guest can respond, Li Hwan's father jumps in, urging the guest to take his son with him. He then turns to Li Hwan and explains that this man is none other than Baek Liho. Confused, Li Hwan admits he doesn't know who Baek Liho is. His father explains that Baek Liho is the leader of the Wulin Alliance, known as the Emperor of Martial Arts. Still skeptical, Li Hwan remarks that his father once told him that the leader of the Wulin Alliance was arrogant, prideful, and unpleasant. After a moment of reflection, however, Li Hwan adds that the man standing before him doesn't match that description. In fact, he's surprisingly handsome. Baek Liho smiles, asking what other unfavorable things Li Hwan's father had said about him behind his back. Embarrassed, the father laughs nervously, admitting that he might have said a few small things. Then, turning to Baek Liho, Li Hwan's father expresses his frustration, complaining that it's Baek's own fault for not visiting them even once in the past 10 years. He reminds Baek that he had saved his life in the past, to which Baek replies, acknowledging that he feels guilty for not visiting sooner. Li Hwan's father grabs his son's shoulder, asking seriously if Baek intends to take Li Hwan with him. Baek responds confidently, saying that unlike him, he won't avoid his responsibilities. Curious, Li Hwan's father asks, "And what makes you think I would?" With a somber tone, Baek Liho responds that he once overheard Li Hwan's father saying he would live happily if someone else took Yoon. A shadow of discomfort crosses the father's face, but he remains silent. The three, father, son, and guest, stand together under the shelter of the house, protected from the rain. This mention of Yoon piques our curiosity, hinting that more of the story remains untold and that future events will reveal the truth. An hour later, the rain stops, and Li Hwan approaches his father, telling him not to punish or starve himself just because Li Hwan won't be around. His father responds sternly, urging Li Hwan to worry about himself instead. He also warns him that Baek Liho is a strict teacher and that the coming days will be tough. However, Li Hwan, full of confidence, replies that he's ready to endure anything to learn martial arts from the leader of the Wulin Alliance. His father smiles with pride, acknowledging that Li Hwan has always been a clever boy. Li Hwan then playfully advises his father to cut back on drinking. Immediately offended, the father insists that he has quit drinking entirely. Li Hwan, grinning, retorts that his father should also stop lying. Furious, the father declares that he's telling the truth and doesn't lie. After their playful exchange, Li Hwan bids farewell to his father and sets off with Baek Liho on his journey to the Wulin Alliance. Riding behind Bayek on the horse, Hwan glances back at the house, his thoughts lingering on his father. Inwardly, he apologizes, knowing he never told his father the whole truth. Hwan recalls the first moments he woke up in his father's old home, finding himself once again in the body of a small child. At first, he believed it was just a dream. When he left his room and saw his father standing before him, he assumed he was speaking to the spirit of his deceased father. Extending his hand in greeting, Hwan asked his father how life was after death and whether he was at peace. But his father, confused by the strange question, smacked Hwan on the head, thinking his son hadn't yet fully woken up. The sharp pain startled Hwan, making him question how he could feel such intense pain if this were just a dream. He noticed the old caretaker cleaning nearby and rushed over to ask if what he was experiencing was real or an illusion. The old man, in turn, tried to slap Hwan awake, but Hwan quickly dodged, assuring him that he was fully awake and didn't need a slap. Alone in thought, Hwan began to contemplate his situation. His father was alive, and the house was exactly as it had been in the past. Could it really be? Yet, he didn't finish the thought. He made his way to the ginkgo tree, observing that it stood tall, just as he remembered it 10 years ago, before lightning had struck and destroyed it. Hwan told himself that if this wasn't a dream, it meant he had truly returned to the past. And since Baek Lee-ho had visited them on this very day before, the same events would likely repeat themselves, with Bayek rescuing him during the storm. Determined to follow the original course of events, Hwan resolved to recreate everything exactly as it had happened, ensuring that Bayek would take him along this time. The narrative shifts back to the present moment, with Hwan riding behind Bayek Lee-ho on horseback. A wave of relief washes over him. He had succeeded in reenacting the events of the past, and Bayek Lee-ho had come once more. Speaking to himself, Hwan vows that this time he won't remain passive. Now that he has returned to the past, he is determined not to repeat the mistakes of his previous life. He'll do whatever it takes to change his destiny. After confirming that he had indeed returned to the past, Hwan sets off with Master Bayek Lee-ho to become his disciple. The scene shifts to a new location, the headquarters of the Murim Alliance. To understand the significance of this alliance, the story takes us back over 100 years. In those days, wars between the righteous sects and the demon sect raged violently, resulting in brutal and bloody conflicts. To counter the demons' aggression, the righteous sects agreed to form a unified organization, the Murim Alliance. The alliance was composed of 9 great martial schools, 5 noble families, and around 100 smaller sects. The leader of the alliance was elected every 10 years through a vote conducted by a council of 50 elders. The position of leader rotated between the 9 major schools and the 5 noble families. However, in recent years, disagreements between the schools and families had intensified, leading to the unexpected election of Bayek Lee-ho as the 12th leader of the alliance. Bayek Lee-ho, renowned as one of the top 3 sword masters in the world, was also the grandson of the head of the Cheonsu school, one of the 3 great schools within the top 10. Since Bayek's rise to leadership, the alliance, once stable, had plunged into a state of tension and internal strife. Returning to the present scene, Bayek Lee-ho and Hwan arrive at the Murim Alliance headquarters. Bayek introduces Hwan to those present, announcing that the boy will become his 4th disciple and instructs them to take care of him. Standing before Hwan are 5 individuals who step forward to introduce themselves. The first, a young man named Hyuk, greets Hwan warmly and tells him to think of him as his eldest brother, explaining that he will be responsible for guiding him. It is revealed here that Hyuk is Bayek Lee-ho's son. Next, a man named Yang steps forward, also welcoming Hwan and introducing himself as the 2nd eldest brother. Both Hyuk and Yang are senior disciples of Bayek Lee-ho, tasked with helping new trainees, earning them the titles of senior brothers. Finally, the 3rd senior brother, named Seumon, steps up with a laugh, telling Hwan that they will be spending a lot of time together from now on. A woman, seemingly the wife of Bayek Lee-ho and the mistress of the household, appears and addresses Hwan, telling him that as the son of the hero Hwan, he surely knows where he stands now. Hwan responds respectfully, confirming that he understands. Behind the woman, A small girl peeks out shyly and introduces herself as Li Yun, the youngest daughter of Baek Liho. Li Hwan greets her with seriousness, prompting her to ask if he is always this serious. He replies that he isn't usually, but he feels a bit nervous at the moment. Amused, Li Yun remarks that boys aren't typically this shy, but her mother intervenes, suggesting that Li Hwan may feel anxious because he has left behind his small hometown to come to the Murim Alliance. Baek Liho steps in, gently asking his daughter not to tease Li Hwan on his first day. Li Hwan reassures Baek that he's fine and has no complaints. Pleased, Baek smiles, though inwardly he notes how Li Hwan's demeanor seems vastly different from how he acted back at his family home before traveling together. Baek then instructs Seumon to escort Li Hwan to his room. Seumon complies immediately, leading Li Hwan through the house. As Li Hwan walks behind Seumon, he feels a strange sense of familiarity. Everything is unfolding exactly as he remembers from his past life. Memories of the battles he fought, both those from the past and those he knows are yet to come, flood his mind. With 10 years left before the Great War begins, Li Hwan resolves to stay out of unnecessary conflicts for as long as possible. However, he tells himself that if things spiral out of control, he'll be ready to make exceptions. When they reach the room assigned to him, Seumon informs Li Hwan that if he needs anything, he can ask Si Pai. He then asks Li Hwan what he thinks of the room. Li Hwan replies that it suits him perfectly. Seumon, curious, inquires about the martial arts Li Hwan had studied before joining the alliance, explaining that he's asking because he had never heard of the Hwan family before. Li Hwan responds that he learned some basic techniques from his father, but his family has no remarkable martial arts heritage. Seumon probes further, asking if there are any warriors in Li Hwan's family. Li Hwan explains that there aren't, and that he had lived with only his father, along with old man Kang and Aunt Lim, the cook. Seumon chuckles at the oddity of the response, remarking that it's unusual for someone with no martial heritage to join the alliance. He then advises Li Hwan to rest, promising to teach him the sect's martial techniques later as his senior brother. Li Hwan agrees, and after Seumon leaves the room, he reflects that it's only natural for the third son of the Cheonsu sect leader to find the idea of a family without warriors amusing. Later that night, Li Hwan sits in deep meditation, practicing spiritual exercises. He contemplates how his return to the past and his reversion to the form of a young child have weakened his strength and energy. He realizes that if he intends to surpass the power he had before his battle with Hans Shinma, he must begin training earnestly to strengthen his internal energy. As he meditates, memories of his encounter with the celestial demon, Hans Shinma, resurface. He vividly recalls every detail of the fight and how his strength had been insufficient to match Hans's overwhelming power, leading to his swift defeat. The pain of that fatal blow still lingers in his mind, and he remembers the final moment before he lost consciousness, seeing Hans Shinma standing victoriously over him. In his introspection, Li Hwan admits that in his previous life he had relied too heavily on his natural talent, wasting 2 precious years in complacency. But now, with a second chance, he knows that laziness is no longer an option. After completing his nighttime meditation, Li Hwan felt a surge of energy coursing through his body, accompanied by a flickering aura around him. He told himself that at least there was some good news. His internal energy had returned to the same level it had been before his return to the past, though now it felt purer and more refined. As he pondered whether this marked the start of his new life in the Murim Alliance, he reassured himself with quiet confidence that he was ready to embrace this new beginning. With that resolve, he opened the door to his room and stepped out into the night. In the courtyard, some members of the Murim Alliance were gathered, engaged in their own conversations. Li Hwan's arrival did not go unnoticed, and soon he found himself walking beside the third senior brother, Seumon. During their walk, Seumon began explaining the structure of the Murim Alliance, mentioning that it was composed of 31 organizations and supported by over 20,000 commoners. Li Hwan responded with apparent interest, expressing admiration for the alliance's scope, though inwardly he already knew everything Seumon was telling him. Seumon continued, adding with a laugh that being the disciple of the alliance leader meant Li Hwan was now part of this vast network. As they walked, Faint murmurs from nearby members reached Li Hwan's ears. Some were speculating about his background, noting that he was said to be the son of the head of the Hwan family. Others asked where this family was located, and someone replied dismissively that it was merely a small estate. Another remarked that the family had already collapsed and suggested that the only reason the alliance leader had taken Li Hwan as a disciple was due to an old friendship with his father. There was also a comment about how fortunate Li Hwan was to become the disciple of the alliance leader. Although Li Hwan overheard every word, he restrained himself and decided it was not worth getting upset over such remarks. He reminded himself that patience was essential, and for now, he needed to endure. His thoughts, however, were interrupted when someone appeared ahead of them, seemingly waiting for their arrival. Seuman greeted the man warmly, referring to him as Brother Wee Hyung, and mentioned how long it had been since they last met. He went on to explain that he was showing the new disciple, Li Hwan, around the Murim alliance. The man, introduced fully as Wee Ji Hyung, the second son of the leader of the Shingam sect, responded with skepticism, questioning whether it was true that this boy was now a disciple. Wee Ji Hyung's gaze lingered on Li Hwan with visible disdain, and he remarked to Seuman that he couldn't comprehend how someone like this could have been chosen as a disciple. Li Hwan's response came swiftly, though not directly. He observed aloud with sharp undertones that Wee Ji Hyung seemed remarkably polite. The comment visibly irritated Wee Ji Hyung, who remarked to Seuman that it would have been more fitting to choose a disciple from a reputable family rather than a boy from a ruined one. Seuman made a clumsy attempt to lighten the mood, smiling awkwardly, though his efforts did little to temper Wee Ji Hyung's condescending attitude. Stepping closer, Wee Ji Hyung leaned in toward Li Hwan and, with a sharp tone, introduced himself as Wee Ji Hyung of the Shingam sect. He then asked, with a trace of mockery, if Li Hwan had a problem with his words about the Hwan family. Li Hwan's reply was measured, his expression calm as he said that he had no issue with anything. Wee Ji Hyung, believing the matter settled, remarked that it was fortunate Li Hwan knew his place. Yet Li Hwan's next words were far from conciliatory. He calmly noted that not everyone who uttered meaningless words was worth engaging with. The unexpected response left both Wee Ji Hyung and Seuman stunned. For a moment, silence hung between them, as Wee Ji Hyung stared at Li Hwan, struggling to process the audacity of the boy's remark. Anger quickly began to boil under the surface, and after a brief pause, Wee Ji Hyung's voice cut through the silence, demanding sharply what Li Hwan had just said. Ignoring Wee Ji Hyung's growing anger, Li Hwan calmly stated that he had said all he needed to, then turned to Seuman, signaling that it was time to leave. Enraged by the dismissal, Wee Ji Hyung barked at him to stop and insulted him, calling him a vile animal. Without flinching, Li Hwan turned to Seuman and asked if all the people in the Murim alliance behaved like Wee Ji Hyung, further provoking his adversary. Wee Ji Hyung, his temper rising, demanded to know what Li Hwan meant by that. Li Hwan, keeping his tone even, remarked that since it was his first time in the alliance, it made sense to ask his teacher such questions. After all, he wasn't accustomed to strangers hurling insults the moment they met. Scoffing, Wee Ji Hyung sneered, asking if Li Hwan planned to complain to the alliance leader. He added mockingly that someone with such low upbringing shouldn't expect any help. Li Hwan, unfazed, responded smoothly, remarking that Wee Ji Hyung must indeed be well-mannered, given how quickly he insulted a stranger at first sight. Li Hwan noticed the way Wee Ji Hyung clenched his fist tightly, his knuckles whitening with frustration. He thought to himself that the other man undoubtedly wanted to punch him right then and there. However, Li Hwan remained composed, fully aware that personal fights within the alliance were considered a serious offense and would lead to punishment for anyone involved. He also knew that Wee Ji Hyung had his fair share of troubles within the Shingam sect and wasn't held in particularly high regard. For this reason, Wee Ji Hyung couldn't afford to get into more trouble. Li Hwan briefly recalled how, in his previous life, he had failed to control himself around Wee Ji Hyung, resulting in a fight that ended with him being beaten and punished, while Wee Ji Hyung escaped unscathed. This time, however, Li Hwan vowed that things would be different. He would not allow Wee Ji Hyung to provoke or overpower him again. He called for Seumon to leave, and the two walked away together. As they departed, Seumon glanced at Li Hwan, both impressed and surprised by the boy's composure and confidence in handling the confrontation. Li Hwan, aware that his actions would likely make Seumon pay closer attention to him from now on, dismissed the thought, focusing instead on how satisfied he felt after standing up to Wee Ji-hyung. The next day, Li Hwan found himself standing before Hyuk Baek, the eldest senior brother. Hyuk handed him a book and mentioned that he had heard about the previous day's conflict with Wee Ji-hyung. Li Hwan responded calmly, stating that the incident was of no real importance. Hyuk, however, cautioned him to be more mindful of his actions in the future, explaining that many within the alliance were watching closely for any missteps from his father, Baek Liho. Li Hwan reassured Hyuk that he would be more careful going forward. Hyuk then instructed Li Hwan to begin studying the spells and stances outlined in the book he had given him. Li Hwan, determined, promised to train diligently. Hyuk went on to explain that Li Hwan should stop practicing the internal techniques of his Hwan family and instead focus on mastering the internal techniques of the Cheonsu sect. He likened the mismatch between internal and external techniques to wearing ill-fitted clothing. It prevents a fighter from fully expressing their power. Li Hwan nodded in agreement, accepting the book and leaving the room deep in thought. As he walked, he reflected on Hyuk's advice, acknowledging that it was sound. Learning two internal techniques simultaneously was risky and could hinder his progress. He knew that if he wanted to excel in the Cheonsu sect's martial arts, he would have to master its internal techniques. Even so, Li Hwan was reluctant to abandon his family's mental techniques entirely. He believed there had to be a way to harmonize both styles, ensuring that he could learn them together without compromising his abilities. At that moment, the second senior brother, Yang, called out to Li Hwan, asking him to come over. Li Hwan approached, wondering what Yang wanted. Inwardly, he admitted to himself that Yang was the most challenging to deal with among the three senior brothers, but also the most helpful in teaching him martial arts and assisting him in overcoming obstacles. However, Yang's blunt approach to problem-solving made him somewhat irritating at times. When Li Hwan reached him, Yang asked directly whether the rumors about the conflict with Wee Ji-hyung were true. Li Hwan confirmed that they were. Yang mentioned that he had heard about how Li Hwan had handled the situation skillfully, though Li Hwan remained silent, unsure whether Yang was being critical or expressing approval. After a brief pause, Yang warned Li Hwan that Wee Ji-hyung would not let the matter rest easily. Yang continued, explaining that he had observed Wee Ji-hyung closely for 3 years. He admitted that, like Li Hwan, he had come from a family that had fallen into ruin and that he had worked alongside Wee Ji-hyung on several occasions. Each time, Yang pushed himself harder and imposed strict discipline on himself, deliberately using the stick approach to ensure that Wee Ji-hyung would neither look down on him nor consider him inferior. Li Hwan listened carefully, surprised by this insight into Yang's life, something he had never known in his previous life and never expected to hear. Yang's tone grew more solemn as he likened the Murim alliance to a pool filled with dragon's blood. He explained that the respect they received depended solely on the fact that their teacher was the leader of the alliance, not on justice or bravery. Yang concluded by stating that only strength could truly protect them in this world. He advised Li Hwan to seize every opportunity to build his power, then dismissed him, saying he had said all he needed to. As Li Hwan turned to leave, Yang called out to him again, telling him that his handling of Wee Ji-hyung had been the right thing to do. In that moment, Li Hwan found himself thinking that Yang, like him, seemed to carry unresolved emotions deep inside. In the next scene, Li Hwan reflects on how the following days unfolded just as he remembered them from his previous life. He explains that Baek Liho, their master, was preoccupied with the affairs of the alliance, leaving the first senior brother, Hyuk, and the third, Seumon, to oversee Li Hwan's training. Although their training methods were not particularly useful to him, Li Hwan navigated the situation cleverly, pretending to be unfamiliar with the exercises and playing his role convincingly. However, when night fell and he found himself alone, Hwan would secretly head to the training hall to practice in solitude. He made sure that no one discovered what he was doing, keeping his personal training entirely hidden. A month passed, and one afternoon, while Hwan was sitting by himself, Leun, the youngest daughter of Baek Liho, approached him. She asked what he was doing, and Hwan responded simply, saying that he was enjoying a cup of tea. Leun then told him that the Dragon's Ascent tournament would begin soon, asking if he planned to attend. She noted that this would be his first time witnessing the tournament. The Dragon's Ascent tournament was a martial arts competition held every 3 months within the Murim Alliance. Due to the large number of martial artists in the alliance, accurately assessing everyone's skills proved challenging. With only a limited number of experts available to evaluate participants, assigning officials was a difficult task. As a solution, the tournament was created, offering fighters 4 opportunities each year to earn promotions, which made it a highly anticipated event among the alliance's members. Hwan recalled that, in his previous life, a serious incident had occurred during the tournament when he attended with Leun. Now, standing beside him, Leun insisted that he accompany her again this time. She mentioned that the second senior brother, Yang, would be participating, and they absolutely had to go. Hwan considered refusing, as he would have in the past, but he couldn't predict how Leun might react if he did. Moreover, he realized that not attending might lead to more serious complications if something unexpected were to happen. With these thoughts in mind, he decided it was safer to accompany her to the tournament. In the next scene, the tournament grounds were bustling with spectators, and the competitions were already in full swing. Hwan and Leun arrived at the arena, with Leun eagerly holding his hand and pulling him toward the front rows for a better view. Hwan hesitated, expressing his concern about the crowd. Leun, however, insisted enthusiastically that they needed to get closer to see everything properly. As Leun tugged him forward, Hwan overheard whispers from the people around them. Some remarked on the young girl attending the event, while others joked that the tournament might not be suitable for someone her age. Hwan's unease deepened, sensing that events were unfolding exactly as they had in his previous life. He tried to stop Leun, telling her that their current spot was good enough, but she resisted, pulling him along again. After a few moments, Hwan firmly decided that they wouldn't move any further. Leun finally agreed, saying that the view from their spot was acceptable. However, Hwan couldn't shake his growing sense of dread. Despite all his efforts to change the course of events, he had once again found himself in the very place where the incident had occurred in the past. He resolved to stay vigilant, determined not to let anything catch him off guard this time. After Hwan and Leun selected their spot to watch the match, the fight began, and the two of them followed the action intently. The audience around them cheered enthusiastically, though their excitement was tempered by disappointment with the overall skill level of the fighters. Except for one combatant from the Demonic Sect, who stood out and earned the admiration of the spectators. As Hwan observed him closely, he recognized the fighter as Yeon-san, a soldier who had once served under his command when he was known as the 9th Dragon Prince in his past life. Memories of his first encounter with Yeon-san at this very tournament flooded back to him, as well as the decision to recruit him into the Hojeong family. Hwan also remembered that Yeon-san had fought alongside him on their final mission, a secret operation that ended in disaster when a traitor within the alliance exposed their plan to the Demonic Sect. Yeon-san was lost during that mission, and no one ever discovered what had become of him. This time, however, Hwan silently vowed, "Things won't end the same way." When the referee declared Yeon-san the winner, Leun clapped with delight, clearly impressed by the fighter's performance. Hwan, however, remained quiet, lost in thought, as he reflected on the past and resolved to change it. His focus was suddenly interrupted by the referee's voice calling out the name of the next contestant. Leun tugged at Hwan's sleeve, excitedly informing him that the next competitor was their second senior brother, Yang. The crowd buzzed with surprise at Yang's participation. It was uncommon for the disciples of the alliance leader to compete in such tournaments, as they were typically granted leadership positions within the alliance without needing to prove themselves through competition. Yang, however, seemed determined to earn his place on merit, rather than relying on his connection to Baek Liho. Some spectators speculated that Baek Liho had orchestrated Yang's participation as a strategic move to gain public support and bolster his reputation. Others acknowledged Baek Liho's exceptional martial skills, but found it curious that the leader of the Murim alliance came from the Cheonsu sect, often regarded as the weakest among the three major sects. Listening to these conversations, Hwan silently reflected on how little the public truly understood about Baek Liho's sacrifices. He knew the truth. Baek Liho had risked his life on a secret mission to thwart the demon sect, and the betrayal from within the alliance had led them into a deadly trap. But Hwan quickly dismissed these thoughts, realizing that dwelling on the past wouldn't help him now. His priority was to protect Liyun, no matter what happened. The referee raised his hand, signaling the start of the match between Yang and his opponent. The challenger, clearly frustrated, seemed determined to win, driven by a desire to prove that he was not inferior to Yang, simply because he wasn't the alliance leader's disciple. With a fierce expression, the challenger launched an aggressive attack, but Yang remained composed, effortlessly dodging the incoming strike with precision. As the fight progressed, the opponent's confidence wavered. Feeling outclassed by Yang's skill, panic began to creep into his mind. His strikes became erratic, slashing wildly in every direction in the hope of landing a lucky hit. Yet Yang evaded each blow with ease, blocking the strikes with practiced skill. Without drawing his weapon, Yang suddenly countered, delivering a flurry of powerful blows with his bare hands. His fists connected with precision, striking the opponent's face repeatedly. With each impact, the challenger staggered, until finally he collapsed to the ground, unable to stand. The crowd fell silent as the referee raised his hand once again, officially announcing Yang as the victor. Liyun was overjoyed at the announcement of Yang's victory, but Hwan remained silent, reflecting that Yang could have prolonged the fight to demonstrate more of his skill. Just as he pondered this, he overheard two people standing behind them making provocative remarks about Liyun. Both he and Liyun turned sharply to see who dared speak about her in such a manner. Liyun demanded to know their identities, and one of them introduced himself as Wonsang from the Cheonsu sect. The other, named Cheonggin, claimed to be from the Manhwa sect. Liyun introduced herself politely, but the two men laughed mockingly, confirming they knew she was the young lady, daughter of the alliance leader. As the conversation unfolded, a commotion broke out at the far side of the tournament ground. Shouts and the clamor of weapons clashing reached them, and they turned toward the source of the noise. A group of people had drawn weapons against each other, and panic quickly spread through the audience. Spectators began running in every direction, trying to escape the chaos. Liyun froze in fear, and before she could react, a passerby running frantically shoved her aside, causing her to stumble. Hwan managed to catch her just before she hit the ground, also blocking another person from crashing into her. When Liyun opened her eyes, she saw the crowd rushing toward them, and panic took hold of her. She cried out for Hwan, who recognized the imminent danger. Without hesitation, he shielded her with his body, standing between her and the frantic crowd. He urged her to run, but before she could move, another person pushed her from behind. Hwan kept his eyes fixed on Liyun to ensure her safety. But as he turned to see who had pushed her, a familiar voice rang out, telling her not to go toward Hwan. To his disbelief, Hwan saw Wee Ji-hyung standing there, a mocking smile on his face. Wee Ji-hyung glanced smugly at Liyun, now trapped in the chaotic, surging crowd and vulnerable to the danger surrounding her. Hwan shouted her name and sprinted toward her. Just as Liyun lost her balance and slipped from an elevated platform, Hwan leapt after her without hesitation. He reached her in the nick of time, grabbing hold of her as they tumbled downward. Though their fall was rough, Hwan shielded Liyun with his body, absorbing the impact as they rolled across the ground. Quickly recovering, Hwan rose, his eyes burning with fury toward Wee Ji-hyung, who had caused this entire ordeal. But the danger wasn't over yet. The crowd continued to surge, and more people were falling from above, heading directly toward where Hwan and Liyun lay. Realizing he had no choice, Hwan braced himself and used his body once more as a shield, covering Liyun to protect her from the falling bodies. The weight of those piling on top of him became overwhelming, and with his small, youthful body, he struggled to withstand the crushing pressure. Yet, he gritted his teeth and resolved to endure the pain, no matter the cost. He knew he had to activate his internal energy to protect both himself and Liyun. Drawing on every ounce of his strength, Hwan focused his energy, forming a protective barrier around them. After a while, the chaos began to subside. Realizing that Liyun, the daughter of the alliance leader, was trapped beneath the tumult, those nearby rushed to help. One by one, the people who had fallen on top of them were pulled away, and soon, Hwan and Liyun were free from the heap of bodies. Though exhausted, Hwan slowly sat up, his energy drained from the immense effort he had exerted. Several people came to help Liyun to her feet, but she refused to let go of Hwan's hand, clinging to him with concern. She called his name repeatedly, her voice filled with worry. Barely able to speak, Hwan managed to reassure her, wanting nothing more than to confirm that she was safe. Liyun, though frightened and exhausted, was more worried about Hwan, who clearly looked worn out and in pain. In the next scene, Hyuk, the eldest senior brother, spotted Liyun with Hwan in the arena. Rushing over with Yang, Hyuk angrily shoved Hwan to the ground and embraced his sister protectively, glaring at Hwan with frustration. He scolded Hwan harshly for bringing Liyun to such a place, making Hwan feel that things had spiraled out of control and taken a turn for the worse. The scene shifted again to Baek Liho's wife, visibly furious as she reprimanded Hwan. She demanded to know how he could have taken a young girl to such a dangerous place and questioned what he had been thinking. Although Hwan apologized, Liyun intervened in his defense, explaining that it was her idea to attend and that she had pressured him into bringing her. Despite Liyun's defense, the lady's anger did not subside, and she continued scolding Hwan, insisting that he should have stopped her no matter what. Hyuk stepped in, asking his mother to calm down and promising to take responsibility for teaching Hwan properly. She accepted his offer, instructing him to also look after Liyun. Hyuk added that Liyun might still be struggling because she had spent part of her life without proper education. He explained that she had lived alone with her father for a long time, which made it difficult for her to adjust to the lifestyle expected of her in this world. Hwan stood silently, though a wave of frustration welled up within him. He wondered why the lady was harsher this time compared to how she had behaved in the past. Although Liyun hadn't been injured this time, as she had in his previous life, the lady's words now carried more severity and humiliation than he remembered. At that moment, Hwan finally understood the reason for the change in attitude. In his previous life, Liyun had been seriously injured during the tournament, forcing Baek Liho to leave his duties as leader and stay with her at Cheonsu. This time, however, since Liyun was unharmed, Baek Liho remained focused on his responsibilities at the martial arts grounds. Hwan realized that the absence of Baek Liho allowed his wife and Hyuk to speak more freely and harshly. In a later scene, Hyuk confronted Hwan privately. With a stern tone, he told Hwan that from now on, he should focus solely on his training and avoid any interaction with Liyun. He insisted that Hwan should not see her again. Hwan, without argument, agreed to Hyuk's demand. As soon as Hyuk left, Hwan heard Seummon's voice calling him, asking him to come to his room. Hwan assumed Seumon intended to scold him, just like the others, but he was surprised by what awaited him. Seumon looked serious and, without preamble, asked whether Hwan had any feelings for Liyun. Hwan laughed, assuring Seumon that he saw Liyun only as a little sister. Still not entirely convinced, Seumon asked again to be certain, and Hwan repeated firmly that Liyun was nothing more than a sibling figure to him. Satisfied, Seumon admitted that he didn't want to trouble Hwan, but warned that even an innocent bond with Liyun could cause problems. He explained that the lady of the house would become even more enraged if she suspected that Hwan had any romantic interest in her daughter, seeing him as unworthy and unsuitable for such a relationship. Hwan reassured Seumon that there was no cause for concern, adding that Liyun herself would never be interested in someone like him. Seumon nodded, expressing trust in Hwan's words, and gave him permission to leave. However, as Hwan left the room, he couldn't shake his discomfort. He knew that, unlike in his previous life, he would now need to keep Liyun away from Seumon, aware of what had transpired between them before. Back in his room, Hwan threw himself onto the bed, overwhelmed by the difficulty of pretending to be ignorant about the future. He wondered if it was truly necessary to let everything unfold exactly as it had in the past. Reflecting on the recent events, the spiteful gaze of Wi Ji-hyung, Hyuk's anger as he embraced Leun, and the harsh words of the lady, he felt trapped. He knew that intervening could alter the course of events, potentially rendering his knowledge of the past useless. Torn between action and restraint, he questioned why he had been given this second chance and what purpose it was meant to serve. Later that night, Baek Lee-ho returned home and sought out Hwan. Apologizing for his absence and inability to train him personally, Baek Lee-ho assured him that it was not intentional. Hwan, this time more mature, responded calmly, saying it was no problem at all. He reflected on how, in his previous life, he had often complained and resented this neglect, but now he understood the burden that came with leading the Murim alliance. Hwan also realized that the elders of the Cheonsu sect would never relinquish their honor as leaders of the alliance, nor would Baek Lee-ho's wife abandon her status as the leader's wife. In the end, it was Baek Lee-ho and Hwan who carried the true weight of their struggles alone. Speaking seriously, Baek Lee-ho expressed relief that Leun had remained unharmed and thanked Hwan for taking care of her. However, Hwan admitted that he had made a mistake and should have prevented her from attending the tournament. Baek Lee-ho smiled gently and joked, asking if Hwan really thought he could stand against Leun's stubbornness. With a faint smile, Hwan acknowledged that it had indeed been a difficult task. Switching to a more somber tone, Baek Lee-ho admitted that he was aware of how others mistreated Hwan with their words. He encouraged Hwan to be patient and endure it, even though he knew it wasn't easy. Hwan assured him that he could handle it, though deep inside, he felt the simmering anger that had been building from the humiliation he had faced. Despite the frustration burning within him, Hwan kept his emotions tightly under control, showing no signs of his inner turmoil to anyone. Hwan then told Baek Lee-ho that he didn't judge people by their status, but by their character. After saying this, he pulled a notebook from his robes and handed it to Baek Lee-ho, explaining that it contained all the observations he had made over the past weeks. However, Baek Lee-ho returned the notebook to him, stating that he had too much work to finish and needed to leave for now. Before departing, Baek Lee-ho turned back to Hwan and conveyed a message from his father. He told him that his father had said he would be away from home for a long time and that Hwan didn't need to return during the upcoming break. Hwan felt a wave of surprise. His father had traveled far in the past as well, but he had never received such a message before. After Baek Lee-ho left, Hwan sat in place, contemplating his notebook and wondering if the recent events, Leun's involvement in the tournament and the strange message from his father, signaled other deviations from the past he knew. However, he quickly realized that trying to make sense of these changes wouldn't help him. Instead, he decided to focus on his primary objective, training. The next day, Hwan dedicated himself entirely to his training. He spent almost every waking moment in the training hall, avoiding other distractions. Yet, he found it difficult to reach the level he aimed for, as his young body lacked the strength and stamina needed to fully execute the techniques. During this time, Hyuk and Yang occasionally visited him, offering advice, though their guidance didn't make much of a difference. Meanwhile, Seumon would also stop by from time to time, though he would merely observe from the sidelines, making brief, unhelpful comments, such as noting that Hwan wasn't focusing enough or saying, "That's not quite right," before leaving without offering any real support. Hwan continued this rigorous routine for 2 weeks, until Baek Lee-ho finally returned home. With his master back, Hwan's training took on new meaning, as Baek Lee-ho began teaching him spells and their external applications. This shift gave Hwan a much-needed boost in motivation. As they trained together, Hwan discovered that he had a natural aptitude for the sword, especially in following precise movements and sequences, as if his body instinctively remembered them from long ago. He realized that strengthening his internal energy was the key to enhancing his swordsmanship. Having sufficient energy would make his strikes more accurate and powerful. Baek Lee-ho watched Hwan closely during their sessions, silently evaluating the boy's movements. and the surprising precision he displayed. As he observed, a thought crossed his mind. Perhaps Li Hwan was capable of mastering the special technique, a legendary and notoriously difficult martial art, one that few fighters had ever managed to learn.